Awesome. Thanks so much. Well, thanks for everyone for joining today and for coming to online to watch Creating Sensory-Friendly Classrooms webinar this evening. Thank you again to Little Wonders Montessori for hosting this evening. So before we get started, I thought I'd just introduce myself. So my name is Kate. If you haven't met me in my last webinar, I'm the owner and occupational therapist at Upside Down Therapy. I'm also one of the senior therapists that work there. I'm originally from South Africa and I completed my training of a Bachelor of Occupational Therapy at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in 2011. But since then, I've completed numerous professional development courses with particular interest in sensory processing, in child development, feeding, toileting, and obviously understanding neurodiversity. So I've worked across multiple health and special education systems in South Africa. And since immigrating to Australia about 5.5 years ago, I've worked within the private sector, providing early intervention services. So besides being an occupational therapy and a business owner, I'm also a co-trainer with Sense Up Training. We host annual sensory integration workshops across Australia where we train other healthcare professionals. I'm also a co-owner of an Australian therapy equipment business called Sensory U, where we manufacture and resell sensory and therapy equipment. And then aside from work-related items, I'm also a mum of 3 little children, and I'm just truly passionate about providing early intervention and all things sensory. And I think my goal at the end of the day is to develop children that are confident, resilient, and happy individuals, regardless of what their diagnoses are or regardless of what their challenges are, really just about ensuring that they can be the best little versions of themselves. So this evening, we're going to be covering a couple of topics. The first one, or actually, no, before we even get to the topics, I'd like to know who's joining this evening. So if you are a therapist or a teacher or a parent, I'd love for you to maybe put that into the comment boxes so that we can just see who's joining us this evening. It just gives us a nice understanding of the type of people that we'll be talking to this evening. So maybe you can drop a comment if whether you're a parent or an educator or another therapist. A parent. Thanks, Anna. So nice to have you here. So even though the topic is about creating sensory-friendly classrooms, it's really also about environments as well. So I think this will be beneficial for both parents and educators, and also, you know, being able to take this home with you, and there'll be some useful tips and strategies you can start implementing immediately within your home and your child's school environment. I see that Indira's typing a message. I'll wait for her to finish. Thanks, and an educator. So Indira, I think today you'll get some really valuable information to help supporting your little ones in your classroom. So as we're going through, I won't be able to stop and answer any questions during the presentation. So if you do have any questions, please again just pop them into the comment box. Karthik will then read it out to me. Hi Lay, thanks, another parent in the house. So yeah, if you have any questions, just pop it into the chat box and I can address some of those questions at the end. But if I don't get to all the questions, please, you're welcome to send me an email. So my email address is hello@upsidedowntherapy.com.au. If you would like to discuss a referral, you're welcome to send an inquiry through the website, or there's a new client form on the website as well, and you can complete that to send through any client referrals that you have that you need some support with. So in terms of going through the content of this evening, we'll be talking about understanding sensory processing basics. So just doing a bit of a recap on sensory processing. My last webinar was on sensory processing. So if you did miss that, please hop onto Little Wonders Montessori website. And if you look under the events tab, you'll see there are recordings. So you'll be able to get some more information about sensory processing there, but we'll do a bit of a recap this evening as well. We will be looking at understanding and recognizing sensory needs in students and what they may potentially look like, and then also doing some practical strategies that you can implement within the classroom and within your home environment to help support our children with sensory processing. So, like I mentioned in the last presentation, we've really explored what sensory processing is in a little bit more in-depth detail and how it impacts child's behavior. So, like I mentioned, it's in the events section at the Little Wonders Montessori website. But just to recap, sensory processing is essentially the way that our brain receives and interprets and responds to information from our senses. So every moment our bodies are taking information from the world around us. So what we see, what we hear, what we feel, what we smell, what we taste, but also from signals within our bodies. So how much our muscles are moving, what our muscles are feeling, what our organs are feeling. Are we feeling hungry? Are we feeling sad? Are we feeling like we need to use the bathroom? So our brain acts like a filter and an organizer, and it helps us figure out what's important and what we need to pay attention to, what we can tune out or what's not important, how we should respond to sensory information. And when this process works well, it supports learning, it supports a child's emotional regulation and their ability to engage and participate in the home and school environments. When it's disrupted, it can make everyday experiences feel very overwhelming. It could even make them feel a bit confused or even a little bit dull, which will obviously then impact their behavior and their ability to engage. So for most children, the brain sorts through all that information quite automatically. So this is an automatic process that happens. We don't have to sift through and think about, oh, what noise was that? Oh, there was a dog barking. Okay, I don't need to worry about the dog barking because I know that's a safe sound. So our brain automatically hears a dog and switches it off. When we hear a siren, we're more alerted to that because we know that there could be danger. If we smell smoke, we instantly think there's danger. So our sensory systems help us alert to information and helps us sift through that information automatically, whether we need to pay attention to it or whether we can disregard that information. This helps children stay calm and pay attention, but also allows them to play with others and learn new things. Some children have sensory processing difficulties, which means that their brains may either over-respond to certain sensory information. So just a recap on the sensory thresholds. So if they over-respond to sensory information, that means they have a small sensory cup. Okay, which means they can become very overwhelmed very quickly. Their brain or their cup fills up too fast. So this might be, for example, sounds that might feel too loud, or they might become very overwhelmed with bright lights or fluorescent lights, or their clothes might feel scratchy even though it's just a tag in the back. They might be afraid of movement, or they might even under-respond to certain information. So that means when the sensory threshold is quite large, so that's like having a big bucket, and it means that it takes a lot of sensory information to fill up that bucket. And oftentimes they might not even be getting enough information from the world around them to allow for those processes to happen automatically. So these children might be under-responsive, or they might even seek extra information to help fill those buckets up. This might look like, for example, not being aware of their body, or being a bit clumsy or a bit rough. They might constantly be touching or fiddling with items or their peers in the classroom. They might be making lots of noise. They might not be able to hear when their name is called in the classroom or even at home. So one of the questions we ask our parents in the sensory processing questionnaire is, do they respond when their name is called? And this is often a tricky question to ask. A lot of parents say, well, is that selective hearing, or is that because they're actually not responding to that auditory information? And some kids might also be seeking out movement. So these kids are the ones that are always on the move, that they struggle to sit still, they're constantly fidgeting, constantly moving, and this obviously then impacts their learning and engagement. So these differences can also impact how children can regulate their emotions, but also how they engage socially and participate in daily routines. So for parents and educators, it's really important for us to understand what this means. And when we recognize the sensory needs, we can then better support our children by adjusting the environment or providing them with simple strategies to help them feel safe and regulated. Because when they feel safe and regulated, they're going to be able to connect, they can play, they'll be able to learn and engage with their peers and others in the environment. So when we're thinking about our sensory systems, we know that we have the 5 basic ones that we know of. So obviously we know there's vision, there's auditory, which is our hearing. We have tactile, which is touch. We have gustatory, which is taste, and olfactory, which is smell. We also have 3 other sensory systems. So we have our vestibular system, which is about movement and balance and understanding coordination and understanding how our bodies are moving. We have proprioception, which is knowing where our body is in space and how our body moves. And then we have interoception, which is our internal sense of body state awareness. So this would include things like knowing when I'm tired, knowing when I'm hungry, knowing when I need to go to the toilet. So let's talk about sensory processing in the classroom. So we know that classrooms are quite overwhelming spaces. Even within our homes can be very overwhelming for our little people as well. Classrooms in our homes often have bright lights. There's lots of loud noises, lots of unpredictability in these environments. There's constant moving. The environments are constantly changing. Every day is different. There's no 2 days that the classroom will look exactly the same. And these factors can really be overwhelming for our sensory children. So every student deserves to be able to access learning where they can feel safe and supported and where they can thrive in these learning environments. So for students that do have sensory processing difficulties, and this includes children that have autism, children that have ADHD, children that are born prematurely, they might have a genetic condition, or they might just have sensory processing difficulties. All these children would benefit from a typical or a classroom environment that can support these challenges. So I'm going to go through a little assessment that I've put together, and I often use this for our educators when I'm going into the education environment. So we'll go through each section and then we'll talk about observations that we might see for children that are over-responsive, so that have a small cup. So if you're looking at the table, the top few are in the first column, and then the bottom few are in the under-responsive column. Okay, and then when we finish with that, we'll talk about some general strategies that we can implement, and we'll then follow that with a case study. So just to help us then consolidate that information that we've discussed. So our first sensory system is the visual system. So our visual processing is the way that we perceive what we see and how we respond to this information. Children that have visual processing difficulties might have difficulty with either being over-responsive, so it's this column over here, or under-responsive. Okay, so like we said, they might have a small cup or they might have a big bucket depending on their sensory profile. So if a child is over-responsive to sensory information, we will find that they will frequently squint or shield their eyes when there's bright light. They might avoid or be distracted by busy visual environments. They might show discomfort with fluorescent lighting or even a screen glare. So if you've got one of those smart boards in the classroom, they might be showing just quite a little bit of discomfort with the glare. They might avoid looking at books with bright or complex patterns, and they might prefer dimly lit spaces. Even avoiding outdoor play areas in bright sunlight might even be a behavior that we will notice. So these children may seek out spaces that are slightly darkened. They might hide under desks. They might become quite overwhelmed. So for those types of children, we'll often try and use more soft natural lighting. So I always try to encourage educators or parents to not put on the big lights overhead, rather use lamps, or if you can, use as much natural lighting as possible. You might want to minimize visual clutter in the classroom. So that's specifically, I know it's a bit tricky with classrooms and home environments as well, but if we can have a space in the classroom that is used for display of artwork and all those beautiful things that you do with your children during the year, but then have other areas of the classroom that are actually quite minimal in terms of visual information. And specifically during morning ring, for example, so if you're sitting in front of the class and you're doing your morning ring, make sure the background that is behind you is actually quite bland, so that it can pay more attention to you rather than being distracted by the visual information behind the educator. You can provide a visually calming area for focus activities. So this is especially important for where you have learning activities or you want them to engage more in focus tasks. And then obviously use quite clear and simple visual aids if need be. So if you're wanting to display, for example, a visual schedule, don't put that on a background that's quite busy. So have it on a blank wall with your very clear visual schedules of what you want to do with your children that day, so that it's easy for them to pick out that important information and being able to disregard everything else. When we have children that have that are quite under-responsive, this means that they have quite a big bucket. So these children might not tune into sensory information as what they should. So you might notice that they'll be staring at objects or people more intently. So they're trying to get more information from the environment. They might be unaware of objects or people in their visual field. So they might often be tripping over items. They might walk into you and might not even notice that there's someone in front of them. I had a little girl in therapy sessions that was like this actually. So I was sitting right next to her and she walked straight over me as if I wasn't even there. So she just wasn't visually attentive to anybody that was in her environment. These children might struggle to visually track moving objects. So for example, like engaging in ball games or popping bubbles, they might not even notice, that there's something in their visual field, or they might have difficulty tracking anything that's moving. They might seek out visual details by getting very close to their books or their peers or objects to look at them. So these children will often investigate visually. So they'll bring the items quite close to their face, or they might even miss visual cues during story time or group activities. So for these children, we often like to use high contrast or colorful materials for them to engage their sensory systems. We want to incorporate visual activities at varying levels of complexity. You might even want to provide frequent changes in the visual stimuli to maintain engagement, so keeping it quite entertaining and exciting for them. And using visual timers will be a great one, or any sort of visual sort of cue to teach them when there's going to be a transition. Okay, because they might not pick on their peers' behaviors of them packing up, but they might be able to see that a visual timer is giving them an extra cue that it's time to pack away. So let's talk about Zara. So Zara often seeks out darkened spaces to play in, such as under desks and inside cupboards. She often complains that the classroom is too bright. So she might cover her eyes, she might tell you that it's too loud, she might get a bit dysregulated. She also struggles to find toys in the classroom, and she becomes very overwhelmed when the room is messy. So some specific activities for her would be to use some soft natural lighting instead of overhead fluorescent lights. We might want to seat Zara away from windows or where there's lots of visual distractions, and also ensuring that items or toy storage is clearly labeled so that she's able to find items a lot easier. All right, auditory processing. So when we're thinking about auditory systems, is how the brain recognizes, interprets and makes sense of sounds. So a child that is over-responsive, so that it means they have the small cup, they might cover their ears if there's lots of noise, or they might even startle, so have that startle reflex. If they are under-responsive, that means they have a big bucket and they might not respond to auditory information. So they might not respond to their name being called, for example. So let's have a look at the table. So the first column says that if they are over-responsive, they might cover their ears. If there's loud noises, they might not even enjoy group activities, or when there's a music session. They'll become quite easily distracted by background noises, so they won't be able to focus if there's a lot of background noise. Now we know our classrooms and our home environments can be quite noisy, so we often find these kids are very distracted, they just can't focus. They complain about sounds being too loud or bothersome. They have difficulty following verbal instructions, especially in a noisy environment, so they won't be able to identify what information is important in that environment. They might also react negatively to fire drills or loud classroom activities. So particularly our children that do have sensitivity, a fire drill can be quite distressing for them. So what we often suggest is, if you can, using noise cancelling headphones, but particularly during activities that they is cognitively demanding for them and they're really struggling when there's a lot of noise. So I wouldn't recommend that noise cancelling headphones are used the whole day. They should only be used at intermittent times or periods of the day. We want our kids to use their auditory system. We want them to listen to and hear information. We don't want them totally closed off from the world using noise cancelling headphones. You might want to create a quiet area in the classroom. So this could be something that could block out some of the sounds, maybe a little sensory tent in the classroom they can go to when they're feeling overwhelmed. You might want to implement some visual cues for transitions to reduce the auditory overload. And you might even want to use some soft music or white background noise to mask the distracting noises or sounds. If a child has a large bucket of tolerance, so they're very under-responsive, so it means they take a lot of information to fill up their buckets, they might not respond to their name being called. They'll frequently ask for repetitions of spoken information. They might appear unaware of loud sounds in their environment, so just totally tuned out to it. They might speak quite loudly or make lots of noises without even noticing, and they can show delayed response to verbal prompts or questions. So you might want to use auditory cues, so maybe using a bell or a clap to gain attention. So some auditory cue that will help them when you're needing attention. Incorporating lots of music or rhyming activities will help them engage better. You could use sound-making toys and activities, so using musical instruments to gain their attention, and ensuring that instructions are clear and repeated as necessary. So let's talk about Jasper. So Jasper frequently covers his ears during music and group play. He frequently runs away, cries, or hides when the classroom is noisy, and at times he may even lash out. So for a child like Jasper, you might provide him with some noise cancelling headphones during noisy periods of the day. You might even give him a warning to say when there's going to be a loud event. So if there is going to be a morning ring, or if there are going to be louder activities, or like maybe a bell is going to ring, or you're doing a fire drill, you might want to give Jasper some warning that that's going to be happening, so he can prepare himself for that. And then let him transition early or later into bigger crowds, so that he can avoid those noises. Sorry, let him transition early or later to avoid noisy crowds. So if everybody is leaving or coming into the classroom at once, allow him to come in at a later stage, because there's early transitional periods is generally when there's the most noise. And you might want to provide a quieter space that he can go to when he's feeling overwhelmed. Let's talk about the tactile system. So some children might have challenges with how they process touch. So some children are very sensitive to touch, meaning that even light touch can be painful or uncomfortable for them. So often our kids that have sort of tags, they really struggle with the feeling of tags. To them, it might feel like a cactus is in the back of their shirt. So it's a real distressing feeling that they're having. And then others might be very hyposensitive or not be under responsive, so they might mean that they seek out more tactile experiences. So looking at the table, a child that has a small cup, they'll avoid touching certain textures. So these kids really don't like doing messy play. They might not enjoy any water play activities or craft activities, getting dirty. They struggle with any tactile inputs. They'll react quite strongly to unexpected touch. They might dislike wearing certain types of clothing or accessories. They might refuse to participate in messy play, so finger painting, for example, and they can get quite upset during grooming activities. So when it's time for them to brush their hair or go for a haircut, these activities can be quite distressing for them. So for those types of children, you might want to provide a variety of tactile materials for choice, so that they can still engage in activities, but they have choice and control of what they might feel is more comfortable. For clothing, you might want them to use soft or comfortable clothing, or remove tags in the clothing. I often recommend to my families that do have children that have sensitivity to touch to look at maybe purchasing clothes from op shops or secondhand items, because these clothes have been washed a couple of times, so the fabric is generally a lot softer. And then just removing tags. Allow participation in tactile activities at the child's comfort level. So some children, when they're feeling a little bit more regulated, they'll be able to tolerate more tactile experiences than if they're feeling dysregulated. And if they do find discomfort, offering deep pressure. So sometimes using a weighted blanket or a weighted vest, or even just applying pressure to the area that feels the discomfort can help relieve that sensitivity that they may be experiencing. If a child has a large bucket, these children will often be seen touching people or objects excessively, so they're constantly fidgeting and touching their peers. They seem quite unaware of minor injuries, so cuts and bruises, they won't even know it's happened. They often engage in rough play, or they seek out quite a lot of strong tactile input from their peers or from the objects that they're using. They might show little reaction to temperature or changes in pain. So these kids will walk around in winter wearing shorts and a t-shirt, and they might even get wet, but it wouldn't even bother them. Or they'll enjoy playing with materials that provide strong sensory input. So they'll, instead of just playing with it, they might cover themselves in slime, or when you have rainy days and you're having a bit of fun outside, these will be the children that are diving into the mud pools, just trying to submerge themselves in those tactile experiences. So you might want to provide a wide range of tactile materials for them to engage in, so they're not constantly seeking that out by touching their peers or fidgeting with objects that they shouldn't be. You might want to encourage hands-on activities and messy play. You could have sensory bins full of various textures and incorporating lots of heavy work to provide some deep pressure to help them regulate. So let's meet Ella. So Ella is a little girl that avoids painting. She doesn't like engaging in Play-Doh and even sand play at school. She becomes quite upset during group times if somebody walks past her, frequently resulting in her lashing out to her peers. So these children often, when someone brushes or touches them unexpectedly, their instant reaction is fight or flight, and it might mean that they might lash out at somebody, and not because they're aggressive, but it's just their central nervous system's reaction to a potentially harmful sense. She will wear the same clothes every day, and she can become quite dysregulated if even just a drop of water is spilt on her. So I'm sure many of us either have a child or have children in our classroom that have this presentation. So some strategies that we can offer for Ella is offering her tools. So if we are doing messy play activities like finger painting or Play-Doh, offer tools so that Ella can still engage in these activities without necessarily having to touch the items. So you might want to provide her with a paintbrush or a rolling pin or gloves or spoons so she can still engage, because we don't want these children disengaging from messy activities, but we do want them to engage as much as what their peers would. Having some opt-in stations for sensory play, so she's not forced to engage in uncomfortable activities. So it's really important to validate these children's experiences. Having these sensory sensitivities is a real challenge for them as well, and we're just not forcing them to do it. So giving them options, so giving them the tools, but also allowing them to have that choice and control whether or not they would like to engage in those activities. During morning ring or during group times, maybe provide the children with a designated dot on the mat that they need to sit on to prevent them from touching Ella. But another one is that you could allow her to enter the group last, so that once everyone's seated, she can find a spot that is less crowded, as well as standing in line. So if everyone's lining up to go to the bathroom, allow Ella to stand at the end of a line so that she's not constantly being touched and bumped by her peers in line. All right, so I've combined these two. This is our gustatory or our taste system, and olfactory, which is our smell system. So if we're having a look at our bucket sizes, so if it's a child that has a small bucket to taste, they might avoid trying new foods or specific textures of food. They might show a strong preference for certain flavors or aversions to others. They might gag or spit out food quite frequently. They might have a limited diet and refuse to eat certain textures of foods, and they can be react quite strongly to the taste of certain foods. And often this comes with negative behaviors. If they have a large bucket, so if they are under-responsive, they might put non-food items in their mouth. So they might seek out those items that are not food items. They will seek out strong tastes and spices and flavors. So these kids enjoy lots of flavorsome food. They might seem indifferent to varied food textures or temperatures, so they just don't have a preference to either or. They might even overstuff their mouths with food during meals and snack times, and they might frequently chew on objects like pencils or clothing. So if you're thinking about strategies for these types of children, if they're avoiding or they have a small bucket, it's going to need to be a referral to a feeding specialist that works with children that have sensory processing difficulties and feeding challenges. What we want to do is create a positive experience around food exposure. So exposure is a really great one, ensuring that they are being exposed to various foods without the pressure of them having to eat it. If a child has under responsiveness or a large bucket to tasting new foods, we want to ensure that we are adding lots of punch and lots of flavors to their foods, so that they can enjoy various food flavors and textures. For the smell section, if they are over responsive, so they have a small bucket, these children will react negatively to strong or specific odors. They might complain frequently about smells that others might not notice. They might avoid certain environments or activities due to the smells. They might refuse to eat or enter areas that have strong food odors, or they might become distracted or upset by classroom scents. So this could even be things like cleaning products. So for these kids, I might make the educator alert to just know that, just being mindful about the fabric softener we're using on our clothing so that it's not too strong, being mindful about which deodorant or antiperspirant we're wearing or perfumes. So any of those strong smelling odors are going to be quite distressing and dysregulating for these children. And it might even mean that a smell could stop this child from engaging. So they might be distracted by the smell. These children actually also struggle with sitting with their friends during mealtime. So often you might notice a child moving away during meal times. This is not because they don't want to sit with their peers, but it might just mean that that the smell of all the foods is just too strong and they can't tolerate that smell. For our children that have a large sensory bucket, so these children might fail to notice strong odors or unpleasant odors. They won't be fazed by these. They might seek out strong smells. So these children might even hold markers and smell them. They might sniff people or objects inappropriately, or they might smell the objects before using them. They might show a little reaction to smells that others can find quite distressing or quite strong. And they might enjoy smelling objects or substances quite intensely. Okay. So let's talk about Sophie. So Sophie can become quite distressed during lunch breaks due to food smells. She gags when other children eat yogurt nearby, and she refuses to eat outside of her limited range of snacks that her parents provide her. So some specific strategies for Sophie. We might allow her to eat in a designated area that has slightly low odor, or even allowing her to sit outdoors where there's a draft coming through. Although we want Sophie to still be part of our meal times, so we don't want her to be excluded from meal times with her peers, but maybe just having a designated area that has a slightly better ventilation. We might want to keep strong smelling items in sealed containers. And also we don't want to force Sophie. Okay, so we want Sophie to guide us so that we know how to best support her. And like I mentioned, feeding is quite a challenging area to support. So if you can, a referral to a therapist that has sensory integration training or therapists that work with food therapy would be helpful. All right, the vestibular system. So this is our sense of balance and movement. So this comes from within the inner ear and helps us know where our body is in space. So whether we're standing, whether we're moving, whether we're upside down. So children that are over responsive to sensory information, they will have a small cup or a small window of tolerance. So these children might avoid playground equipment or activities that involve movement. They're quite fearful or anxious of heights or even things that are like uneven surfaces. So even any balancing activity can make them feel quite anxious or fearful. They get very dizzy very easily, or they often just avoid engaging activities that changes the position of their head, not even necessarily spinning activities. They prefer quite more sedentary activities over active play. So they always are the ones that are seated indoors, that don't want to go play outside. And they might even hesitate to participate in group physical activities like morning ring or during dance sessions. So these children are quite hesitant to movement. So what we might want to do is introduce movement activities gradually, provide a stable or stationary, a stable base for activities. So instead of having them walk across a balance beam, for example, perhaps we could just have a line on the floor that they can walk along, so they can feel more confident in engaging in obstacle courses. You might want to use equipment like rocking chairs or balance cushions just to give them a little bit more movement and to help with that displacement of the position of their head, and ensuring that we can provide them with gentle and predictable movement experiences where they're not feeling fearful. Okay. These children do have a real big sense of fear. And what's important here is understanding head position. So what we want to encourage is try and encourage different positions of the head, but doing that in a slow, gentle way so that they're not fearful. Whereas our under-responsive children is our children have big sensory buckets, and so they need a lot of that information to fill up their buckets. These children will often crave intense movement activities. So these children are constantly spinning or swinging or doing handstands and cartwheels. They're seeking out intense movement activities. They're constantly on the go. So I know we all have these children in our classrooms. They're constantly fidgeting. They need lots of movement. They show poor balance and coordination. So because they're constantly moving, they're not able to refine that motion or those movements efficiently. They often seek opportunities to jump and crash and climb, and often they engage in risky behaviors without their parent concern for safety. So for these types of children, we want to ensure that we're incorporating lots of movement breaks throughout the day so that they can fulfill that movement need or their movement buckets so that they can engage in sedentary activities where they need to sit and learn. So trying to incorporate movement activities prior to sitting on the mat or prior to doing a desktop activity will help these children regulate and be able to attend better. Provide access where you can to swings and trampolines. So those little indoor mini trampolines are great. Climbing structures where they can swing and hang from. If they are seated, providing them with little fidget tools or alternate seating options. So this might include like a little wobble cushion, like I mentioned earlier, but even something that maybe they can potentially hold in their hand just to keep them their hands occupied. And obviously designing obstacle courses that encourage lots of active play. So let's look at Leo. So Leo is a little guy that loves to spin. He's frequently on the mat, fidgeting with his friends. He often falls out his chair during group time activities. He becomes upset if he's asked to sit still, and he often gets up to move around the classroom quite often. Okay, so for Leo, we might want to schedule more frequent movement breaks. And this could be anything like, hey, Leo, can you go and fetch everybody's water bottle? Or Leo, do you want to rub out my board? Or so just giving him little movement jobs throughout the day to help him stay regulated. You might want to offer him a little wobble cushion or a peanut ball for seating so he can get a bit of movement while he's sitting. And you can even offer some flexible seating options. So allowing him to stand at a desk instead of sitting. Perhaps he can go into lying on his tummy on the mat during working. So encouraging lots of those different positions during working. And giving him jobs in the classroom that will involve movement. All right, the proprioceptive system. So this system, I'm just going to cover the top, the bottom section, the under-responsive section. We don't often get children that are over-responsive to proprioception. So proprioception is our sense, is a sense for our body's ability to understand where our position is in space, our movement, but also understanding force regulation. So essentially it's body awareness. So it's understanding what our body is doing. It tells us where our limbs are without looking at them, how much pressure we need to use when we're holding onto a pencil or we're holding onto a spoon, but also how hard or with how much force we have to push, pull, or throw something. So, for example, throwing a ball. So this sense comes from within inside our muscles and joints. So just looking at the under-responsive section, these children might frequently bump into people or objects because they have poor body awareness. They don't know where their body is, so they're just constantly bumping and knocking themselves. They might have lots of bruises, which is another telltale sign. So if children have lots of bruises, it may mean that they might be a bit clumsy and uncoordinated. They will seek out activities that involve crashing and jumping and often looking for heavy work activities. So they're pulling items or can be quite rough and tumble with their peers. They often use excessive force when they're handling objects. So They might mistakenly by accident break toys quite often because they just don't know how much force they need to apply to when they're using handling objects. So for some strategies, we want to incorporate some more heavy work activities in the day. So getting them to carry books or push water carts or even going digging in the sand pit. They might want to pull on, do some tug of war activities. Using weighted vests or body socks is a great one to provide some proprioception as well. And providing resistance-based activities, like mentioned, like a tug of war activity, and encouraging activities that use whole body movements. So let's meet Mason. Mason often hugs his peers too tightly. He chews on his jumper or the collar of his jumper. He crashes into, during mat time, he often just crashes into the mat. He struggles using appropriate pressure when he's coloring, and when he plays with toys, he often breaks them. So some strategies for Mason would be to provide some heavy work activities. So this could mean like stacking chairs or carrying books, offering some chewable toys like a firm textured snacks, or even snacks that are chewy like beef jerky. Offer him weighted items to use during sedentary activities, so maybe having a little weighted lap pad or a weighted teddy he can hold. Practicing body awareness games. So Simon Says is a really great one to use for these children. Even yoga is really great because they need to sustain those body positions for a long time. So it uses a lot of their muscles and joints. And then incorporating some proprioceptive play before transition. So before moving on to the next activity, you might want to get them to do an animal walk to the bathroom, or use an animal walk to come in from outdoor play. And this will all help with down regulating them as well, so making them feel regulated, but also provide them with that good body awareness so they're not coming to sit on the mat and sit on their peers. So creating sensory-friendly classrooms means that we need to design an environment where all students, especially those with sensory processing difficulties, can feel safe, they can feel focused, they can be ready to learn. It's not about removing all sensory input, but offering some choice and predictability for these young children, and support so they can also regulate and thrive in the environment, even if they do have challenges with sensory processing. So some of the core strategies that I would suggest is looking at offering sensory choices. So if you can, provide some flexible seating options, providing them with some sensory tools, or even activities that can accommodate their different needs. So this could be a noise cancelling headphone, or fidgets, wobble cushions. If they can have a desk where they can stand at, that'll all be very helpful. Reducing the environmental overload, so simplifying visuals, reducing noise levels where you can, using calm lighting to prevent overstimulation. So just trying to reduce that environmental overload. Build in movement breaks. So this is really important. We will be covering movement and regulation in the next webinar as well, but scheduling sensory or movement breaks throughout the day, because movement is really important for children to self-regulate. Creating calm and safe spaces. So if we can, offer a space in the classroom like little tents in the bottom of those pictures where they can cool down. Okay, so this is not the naughty corner or where children go to when they're already dysregulated. This is to help support those children when we can see there's going to be an escalation. So just somewhere where they can tap out of all the out of the sensory information or the overwhelming environment that they're in, so they can feel a bit more regulated. Using visual supports and having predictable routine. So predictability lowers stress. And if we have very clear schedules and clear instructions and visuals to help children understand what's coming next, you'll find that you're going to have a child that's a little bit more regulated. And then obviously respecting the individual profile. So every student is different. We need to partner with our families and their occupational therapists. So if they have any other specialists involved, to learn what's going to be different, what's going to be the best for each child. So every child has different sensory profiling, and it's important that we can understand that so we can support them. But yeah, so understanding sensory systems and the impact on classroom behaviours help create supportive and inclusive environments for our little people. And with just simple adjustments, we can't change everybody, every classroom to suit every need, but we can make just simple, small little adjustments and strategies to meet their sensory needs. We'll be able to enhance their ability to learn, but also to engage and thrive in the school environment. the goal is to create environments that obviously offer predictability and flexibility, and ensuring that we are sensory informed and we can provide those strategies to support all our learners. Thank you. That was the end of that. I hope that was helpful. And yeah, I hope throughout the presentation you were able to think about the little people that you support. And yeah, hopefully there were some nice little strategies in there that will help support all those children. So feel free to put any questions in the comment box or in the chat. I'd be more than happy to answer those for you. Thanks, Karen. Yeah, I hope there are some strategies that you can take away, this evening and implement immediately. I think, yeah, the goal was that it's, like I said, we can't help all our kiddies, but if we can provide just small little tweaks and strategies that will just provide a little bit of relief for our kids that do have sensory processing difficulties, I think we can make a big difference in the classrooms and for all our children. Perhaps if you could say yes in the comment box if you have any children that presented as any of our case studies. Thanks, Anna. Yeah, movement seeking. A lot of our kiddies struggle with movement, and there is an overlap between sensory processing and ADHD, for example. And yes, just about determining which one it is. There are different treatment strategies. So sensory processing strategies, like we suggested today, will help these little kids. But if it is ADHD, obviously we need a little more investigation to see how we can support these children.
Kate, there is a question in the Q&A area. The question is, I have a 2-year-old girl that would refuse to eat the whole day. Her parents suggested to give it to her or leave it on the floor, which we did, but she would refuse to eat anything but bland cookies or biscuits. She also has a tendency to eat sand, dirt, and bark. Do you have any techniques or suggestions regarding this?
Yeah, thanks, Reg. And I think, like I mentioned with the gustatory section, it is quite a tricky section. So it's really about investigating. There could be medical challenges happening for this little girl as well. So when we do have children that do eat things like sand, dirt, bark, or any non-food items, what we'd need to try and identify is the why. Okay, so is it sensory? So we can see, I immediately think, okay, those are all crunchy items. So maybe she's seeking that texture. So, and even cookies are crunchy. So she's a little girl that has a preference to crunchy items, but she doesn't like very strong flavored items. So things like crackers might be good for her as another option. So thinking about items that are crunchy that we can offer her throughout the day. But because it seems like there's a little bit more going on for her, I would maybe look at having, I would recommend to the family is doing a full medical workup. So just making sure that there's no iron deficiencies, there's no other deficiencies that she has, even ensuring that her gastrointestinal tract is working appropriately. So sometimes these kids can be quite constipated as well, because if you imagine they're not eating a really good, healthy, well-balanced diet. And then I would refer this little one onto an occupational therapist so they can do a full sensory assessment to understand the why behind her behaviors. She's a little girl that to the parents we need a lot of education. So just understanding her sensory profiling and her sensory systems, but also around food therapy. So understanding what options they can do to help support having a varied exposure to certain food items. So we know for these little people, we often give them what they eat, because even if their food variety is small, you're offering what they eat because you know that's what they will eat. But essentially what we're doing is that we're then not exposing them to other food items, which is going to make them more sensitive to those food items because they're not being exposed to them. So there's a bit of a hierarchy and a bit of a way that we work with these children to help support them in being exposed to various food items, and then working quite closely with the therapist and the medical team to ensure that we're meeting all those different sensory demands and different needs. But yeah, it's really hard when you're working with little ones like this, because especially I can see with her, she eats only bland foods. She is seeking out crunchy, so there's a little cue for us as well. So trying to incorporate more crunchy items or crunchy options for her. But yeah, you can't force these little ones to eat, because for them it's a real sensory experience. It's a real distressing environment for them when they are forced to eat. So definitely a referral to an occupational therapist that specializes in sensory processing. Thanks, Lay. Thanks for joining tonight. Yeah, and if you're needing more support, you're welcome to obviously get in touch with me at Upside Down Therapy. But yeah, otherwise, from Little Wonders Montessori and Upside Down Therapy, thank you so much for joining us tonight.